Hello and welcome to another episode of Metal Effort. My name's Nehemiah, and today we're going to be looking at this piece of metal, the Spyderco Kapara. Full disclosure, this is on loan from Nick Shabazz. When Nick Shabazz gets knives, you never know if this is going to be the best quality assurance one ever or not. It's a possibility, so I just want to make you guys aware. Let's get into the size comparison. We've got our old classics. We've got the PM2. And we've got the Para 3. So again, another little Spyderco family. The Kapara is a very long bladed knife. This is a 3.6 from the edge of the handle, about 3.44 in terms of cutting edge, which is how long the entire PM2 is from the shoulder. So this is a pretty long knife. I'm kind of refraining from calling it a big knife, even though some might be able to interpret it that way. It doesn't feel correct to call it a big knife, even though it's got a very long blade. Here's a couple extra size comparisons. We've got the half track, we've got the full track. So again, we want to give you an idea how big this knife is. Again, when you have it next to a big knife like this, like the actual cutting edge are pretty similar in these two knives, but this is a big knife. There's definitely a distinction between the two. So even though it's a large knife, and some people might be scared of the 1.6 or the 3.6 rather blade, I think, overall weight and things like that, you don't want to immediately not count the Kapara. Speaking of weight, let's do a quick weigh-in to see exactly what I'm talking about in regard for that. There's a lot of carbon fiber on this knife, and so it's 3.32 ounces, 3.3 we'll call it. Definitely under an ounce an inch for this knife. And 3.3 is pretty just objectively lightweight for a pocket knife. So even though it's got a gigantic long blade, it's not necessarily not bad in the pocket. With that out of the way, let's get into our dent, the decent, the excellent, the nitpicks, and the terrible of this piece of metal. First off, in the decent, I really like this blade shape. I was pointed out to one of my non-knife folk friends, and first thing he said when he saw this was that it looked like a plague doctor kind of beak, I guess, and I can kind of see what he's saying. It doesn't normally have that little swoop, but for whatever reason, it does kind of make you think of like a crow's beak or something along that. Very unique, very distinct. I don't know of too many knives that have this particular blade shape, and so it's kind of the first thing that jumps out at you when you're looking at the knife open. One aspect of the blade is just how thin it is. So we're looking at it here compared to like the PM2. Again, this is a longer blade, but the thickness on the spine is a lot less. It's about 0.11 inches in thickness, which is very thin considering the size. Behind the edge, it's very, very finely ground. This is a very good cutter, and a lot of that has to do with the blade shape and just the geometry, the thickness. I like that. And you'll notice the CF. The CF is actually really well done. It's kind of got this like marble look to it, even though it's not marbleized. Not a strict plaid pattern that you would normally have on CF. It's very unique, very distinct, and it's very well done. It feels good. It has a unique look to it, and I think they really pulled it off with the CF department. And being made by Taichung, I think this has, this is the perfect Spyderco factory to build this. You've got the pivots here, which are very clean and nice, not your standard pivot, coming out of Spyderco knives. Something a little bit unique, a little flair for the knife. Not the same color as anything else. It's kind of a unique shade on the pivot. It just adds a little bit of subtle flair to kind of tie in this very gentlemanly but not knife. One of the things to remind you that this isn't a gentleman's knife, aside from the size, is this little splash of red on the back spacer. I don't think the color choice is arbitrary. This has to do with the red back, the Black Widows in Australia, which is where the designer of the knife, Alistair Phillips, is from. So it's a nice way, visually it's appealing to me, I guess, a little splash of color. I don't mind it at all, but it's also just a little bit of a wink toward, where the designer was from and kind of giving, the Australians something to rally behind. And I think that's kind of cool. I like a little bit of a backstory behind a design or a color choice in a knife. I think that's fine. This uses one of Spyderco's standard wire clips. Again, I really like wire clips. I think when I was first getting into the hobby, they looked a little bit cheap or chintzy to me. But just given the extreme practicality of, obviously being round, there's no sharp edges on this. This isn't going to be uncomfortable on your hand. It's deep carry. It's easy to move back and forth. It's reversible. It's just a really good practical clip. It's very lightweight. No mess, no fuss, easy peasy. And I think, Spyderco favoring the wire clip is a good thing. You'll notice there is a lanyard hole on the knife, but, it's in my favorite location if you're going to have one, which is kind of up out of the way of the blade and behind the clip placement. I don't want it taking, priority over the clip. I think that's silly. We've talked about this in many videos, but I think this is the way to pull it off. You can easily hook in your lanyard. It's going to work just as well, whether the hole is here or here. But for people that are not using the lanyard as their primary way to handle the knife, you have the clip, and it's going to be a very, very deep carry in that clip because of the placement. So I appreciate those small, design choices, and I think it's a step in the right direction, and I hope it's on more knives. Speaking of how well this carries, this is kind of a wide knife, as, Spydercos that have the Spidey hole tend to be. This is a very wide knife, similar in vein to like a PM2, which is also a Spyderco compression lock. You got to make room for this hump, and the hole is definitely smaller on the Kapara than on like a PM2 or even the Para 3, to be honest. I think this is still, wider by a good margin. And so, by making that ever so slightly smaller and having this kind of crazy blade shape, it's very smooth, this blade, the sweeping thing here. So as far as getting it in and out of your pocket, like that really isn't going to catch up on anything when you're getting it into your pocket. And then as far as getting your hand by on this side, there's no flipper tab. It's arched. It's a long knife, and it's kind of a wide knife, but it doesn't feel that wide or that long. It actually carries quite well. I'm very, very pleased with the carryability of such, a long bladed knife. And it's part of the reason I don't like calling this a big knife. It just, in practical purposes, in your hand, it doesn't feel big. In your pocket, it doesn't feel big, even though it does have a long blade. Last thing we'll talk about in the decent is that fit and finish that, it's possible was handpicked for Nick. I don't know. But, I haven't heard too many complaints about the fit and finish on Kaparas anyway. And, just generally speaking, stuff coming out of the Taichung plant tends to be really good. And so I'm not going to say, this is probably the only one that's got a good fit and finish, but I'm going to say, hey, this is pretty much perfect in terms of, centering, being aligned, no gaps. The CF is basically perfect. There's no imperfections that I could find. Really, really, really well put together knife. Even the lanyard hole, let's see if we could see this, there's maybe a little bit of not perfect placement inside that lanyard hole as far as lining it up, but that's like a 97 out of 100 as far as how clean or good that is. So definitely passing here on the fit and finish scale. It's something that, I'm pretty pleased by. Now let's get into the excellent. I've got a couple excellent things to talk about. The first is the ergonomics. Now this CF is, pretty comfy. They did a good job of finishing it, but it's also contoured. And so being contoured and thin in this geometry, it ends up being very comfortable. There's kind of two grips in the knife. This grip, where you're actually not having your index finger below the pivot, is actually very comfortable. It just fits naturally, and I feel like it gives you plenty of purchase. You feel pretty connected to the blade even if your finger is back here. And, even if this wasn't a place for me to put my finger, if that was not like a finger choil right there, I think this alone is still so good. It fills the hand, it has a palm swell just like it should, like right here, and it just, boom, sits in. Got a little bit of room on the edge for my pinky. It's not a problem. It's not falling off. And this is incredibly comfortable. But then to be able to choke up and get into the second grip, it kind of points the nose of your knife down a little bit more. This tends to put it more of a straight, and this tends to, loop it in a little bit better. So as far as like food prep, this is a really, really, really nice blade and handle shape. It's kind of taking into account my ability to get on a cutting board, and if I need to get flat and very close, I can by pointing that nose of my blade with that very subtle belly to boop 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 boop. But if I'm doing like normal, just cutting boxes or whatever, I could do the back here grip and get more of the blade as I cut the boxes. And so very comfortable in the hand, not just in, there's no hot spots and it feels good, but just kind of the practicality of why you would be in one grip as opposed to another grip. It's very well thought out and very good. Excellent, in fact. My last excellent thing, and I've been kind of alluding to this a little bit, is just how well this actually cuts. Being such a tall grind, being such a tall blade, being so thinly ground, just the shape of it, everything is very, very much conducive to slices. Even the pinch grip that I neglected to mention, for cutting, if I'm chopping up something. I did a lot of testing in just food prep, and it's really good. I would say it's not quite as practical or as good as the Spidey Chef. The Spidey Chef gives your knuckles just a little bit more clearance, I would say, but the actual cutting, not counting the room for the knuckles, I would say is just as good on the Kapara as it is on the Spidey Chef. So that's high praise. I think the Spidey Chef is probably one of my favorite slicers I've ever experienced, and this is probably my second favorite in terms of just raw cutting power, slicing power. This is really, really, really good. I would say it's actually a little bit better at making penetration, pointing into clamshell than the Spidey Chef. So I'd say the Spidey Chef is a little bit better in the cut, and this is a little bit better in the stab. But otherwise, very close and very similar, and both very good. This knife, it's not perfect, and I want you to really just, before I get into the negative bits of the knife, I want you to remember that I just said this is my second favorite cutter. So keeping that in mind, we're going to go tread carefully into these nitpick and terrible waters, and I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying. Not the overall, is this knife good or bad, but the individual points and whether or not it's important to you. First thing we'll talk about with these nitpicks is the placement of the spider hole / the size of it. Now, on a PM2, it's right where it should be. In terms of being able to flick it out, Spidey flick with authority, it's exactly where it needs to be. I have enough room here to kind of cock my finger back and flick it out. I'm not having to do like some awkward, weird finger gymnastics to get it there. It just naturally, if I'm going to load up my fingers, flicking power, it's going to want to go right there. That's exactly where the hole should be, and it works great. Now, on this, if I make that flicking gesture, I do the same thing when I'm holding the knife like normal. My finger wants to be here, and obviously having the spider hole here would look really bizarre. Even though maybe practically it would actually help with a little bit more power behind the flicking. Next thing is the diameter of the hole is not such that I can actually get my entire finger in there. And so when I stick my fingernail in there, it's actually really awkward. It's like fingernails on a chalkboard, because when I go to flick it, it's actually only touching my nail on the way out. And so the curve of my nail, these two sides, is like scraping against the hole as it moves. And so you could do it, but it's very awkward and kind of uncomfortable. So what I've started to do, and this is gonna be hard to get on camera, is sticking the meat of my finger in the hole so it doesn't get my fingernail at all. But then I don't have the same flicking power. And so I'm like constantly fighting this, my fingernails like basically being shaved off as I like contort in the hole, or do my like finger meat and then it not really have that much power. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible. I mean, I could totally do it. I can concentrate. I didn't do that on purpose. It's just a little bit more awkward is what I'm trying to get at. And so this isn't like a vital part of the functionality of the knife, right? Because I care about Spidey flicking, and that's something that's important to me, Nehemiah. But how important is that to everybody? I don't know. It's the Spidey hole. The whole point is that it's dynamic. I can open it like a Sebenza if I want. I can, do crazy things where I'm like dropping the knife or dropping the handle. There's different ways to use that spider hole. But as far as like my personal favorite, it's not fun or comfortable or natural to do that. There, I did it. And so I find myself when I want to use the knife, if I'm not fiddling with it, I don't want to fiddle with this knife. Basically, spoiler alert, this is not a knife I want to fiddle with. But if I practically as a knife, it's a great cutter. And so when I grab the knife and I open it to cut, I do the Sebenza open and it works perfectly fine. So it's not like this isn't inhibiting your use of the knife in any meaningful way. It is what it is. Speaking of the action, that kind of the geometry of it, I think it's on phosphor bronze. Taking the knife apart, you'll notice that the washers, and you can kind of see them in here, are pretty small. They're very small. That's not necessarily in and of itself like a big deal. That's not a huge deal at all. But it just means that you have a lot less surface area to really put, lubrication on. You could also argue there's less friction when you do that. I don't know. But the end result, I'm not going to speculate too much on why it's like this. But when the compression lock is not compressed, the action of this is not like the best. It's fine. It's definitely not as loose or as smooth. Like it didn't even engage there. There we go. As my PM2s and my Para 3s, where it doesn't, even if I'm not just compressing the compression lock, this is smooth as butter, and I could just not get the action to where I wanted it to be without making severe blade play. So no blade play, it's not going to be good action. As far as like not compressing that compression lock, this is not the smoothest knife. Which is, partly to be, expected of, if I have a PM2 and I'm off the compression and I close it, it's a little bit smoother. And so there's something to be said. I don't know if it's this particular knife or the design of it, but I'm calling it like I see it. Next nitpick is not really a fair one, but I think it's enough of a thing that I am going to talk about it. And, this has to do with how much I liked cutting with this knife. But I just think this knife screams for LC200N being at least an option, if not the option, for the knife steel. This is clearly made for the kitchen. LC200N has, proven itself as a good EDC knife. You're not worrying about, super duper low toughness or it getting dull like H1. Like it really is like a 5 out of 5 on anything other than 5 out of 10, I should say, on anything other than, corrosion resistance. But that corrosion resistance is so uniquely powerful in the kitchen that if this knife is kind of designed for that steel, which Spyderco has proven they got it down. They can source it, they can heat treat it, they have that, already set in their supply chain. Why does this not have LC200N? Is it something that Tai Chung is having a hard time with? Which I could totally see, but maybe this would have been better made at Golden, Colorado, if that's the case, or You should really step up your LC200 game so it's in all your factories. I don't know what the specifics are of that. I just know that I desperately think that and want LC200N to be on this knife. I think it just makes a lot more sense than S35V or S30V, which is a fine steel and it can be in the kitchen, but I think LC200N would have knocked it out of the park. Okay, so now we're moving into the terrible, and I do have something that's terrible, and it's kind of two things, but it's for one reason. The compression lock. It has this like critical flaw here. Now, first thing, the metal part that you're grabbing, is flush with the top of the knife. If you look at it this way, it's not sticking up at all, right? So the only way that you're really getting in there is from this little cutout to let your thumb come in, horizontally and push it over, okay? And that's similar to the PM2. I can't see the flipper tab. The cutout is a little bit better, but the real issue here is that you can see the end of this, what would otherwise be called a liner lock, right? This is the liner lock. My finger goes here. The end of that is right there. You can see it. The end of that little compression lock is right there. On this one, when you're looking at it from the back, come on, focus. You can't actually see the end of the liner lock. It's going deep into the tang of the blade. So what that means is if I've got a bigger chunk pushing off over here, I have to push this further to get the end of that to push to actually clear the blade tang. So what happens is you push it and you think, oh, it's still locked. I have to push it even more. So you almost have to get it flat up against the CF scale before it actually disengages. And what that means is because you don't have as much room here, this doesn't go as deep to like get access to that, is that it hurts. That you have to like put, I would say, 3 to 4 times the pressure to disengage that freaking lock. Like, this is not okay. I think, you design a knife in AutoCAD or whatever it is, you make a prototype, and the first time you go like, ah! That's when you're like, oh, we gotta figure something out. Either make this cutout deeper or longer in this way so I can get closer to the edge of where I need to be pushing in to give me a little bit more leverage. You make the whole thing happen closer to the, because you got this little gap right here. And that gap is meaning that our leverage that we have is just way less than it should be. So there's a combination of things that is kind of playing against us. We're too far back. It's not deep enough. The little liner lock bit that's going into the tang of the blade is too long. We need to redesign this. It works, but you're not getting... I have to it's too much. I have to push really hard, and you see the mark on my thumb. Can you see that mark? Mark. There you go. That is not fun. I don't like it. Like the gouge right there, trying to get this knife undone. So what it means is that the close is not good because I don't want to hold that compression lock down the whole time. And so there's no free fall action whatsoever. So as soon as I disengage the knife, I stop pushing down on the compression lock because I want to stop murdering my thumb or finger. And so now it's really bad. I mean, I can hang on to the blade and it just stays there, right? Like this, that's pretty tight. And this is after I cleaned it out and lubed it. That's a little too stiff for me. And it's because I can't compress the compression lock. This matters a lot to me. This matters a lot to Nehemiah Daniel Rome. But, it might not matter to you. In terms of opening it, if you're cool with the Sebenza open, and then you're okay with that one moment of pain, and then you close the knife, and maybe you're only using the knife maybe once a day or something like that, and you like everything else about the knife, you like the blade shape, you like the length, you like the steel, then, you know, I see why people like the knife. There are flashes of brilliance here in the ergonomics, the blade shape, the cutting power. But for me personally, in terms of action, what an action snob I am, this is a no-go. Even if they came in with a LC200N before I reviewed the knife, I would have been like, oh yeah, and I would have bought it right away. Now, I would wait for other people to be like, hey, did they fix the compression lock at all? Did they open this up at all? If the answer is no, I don't think I would buy that knife, even if it had LC200N. And not saying a lot, being that LC200N is one of my favorite steels, and I do use my knives in the kitchen more than I probably should. So what's the conclusion on this sucker? I think it's a good knife. I think it deserves the accolades that people are giving it. I think that, you know, for me, I guess the compression lock being crappy, you know, access to is a deal breaker for me. This is definitely in the terrible section, and that's not even like factoring in that it's destroying my action. You know, even if this was easy to get into, the placement of the hole makes it such that I don't necessarily want to flick it out like I would normally be doing. So even fixing that would just be, okay, I would own a knife, you know, with everything else that this is bringing to the table if this wasn't so painful to unlock the knife. But I still wouldn't be fidgeting with the knife. It still wouldn't be one of my favorites. So there's kind of like two things that I think are really keeping this out of, you know, my collection. If neither of those things are important to you, then you might want to consider this knife. If not, if you agree with me on one of those two things or both of them, I think you should probably steer clear unless they come out with a second version or tell us that there's, you know, some kind of update to that compression lock. I think you can find better knives elsewhere, like the Spidey Chef. That's all I have for you. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.